the mind is undoubtedly an abstract concept. By that I mean, like Guy Claxton puts it actually, you can't put it against the wall and photograph it. It's outside of the reach of all of our senses. You can't see or touch it, taste it. And given the fact that it is abstract, and given the fact that we do seem to be able to think about it and talk about it, we must be thinking and talking about it using metaphors. And here I'm referring to the work of cognitive linguistics like Lakoff and Johnson and so on. And I think it's pretty robust, those ideas, that when we think about an abstract concept, we do so through the use of conceptual metaphors, even when we don't realize we're doing it. So the mind itself, as I said, is abstract, so we must think about it and talk about it using metaphors. And to the extent that we do talk about it, the sort of language we use reveals the processes of our thoughts, reveals the conceptual metaphors that are happening and being mobilized beneath the surface of our consciousness. There's a number of metaphors for mind. The mind is a kind of machine. The mind is a kind of society. I'm thinking of Marvin Minsky's Society of Mind here. But I think one of the most productive and the most frequently used, really, is one of a cluster of metaphors that Lakoff and Johnson identify, called substance metaphors, where you identify an abstract entity by reference to a certain kind of substance. And in the case of the mind, I would say the most dominant substance that's used is a liquid, perhaps water. So when we think about the mind, I suspect that one of the things that's happening beneath the surface of consciousness is that metaphors about water are being mobilized. And that is revealed, I think, in some of the language that we use, not just colloquially, but also in the psychological literature, for example. So, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, the psychologist, talks about a particular mind state he calls flow, suggesting that there's a sort of an operation there in which the mind is unobstructed. Gershwitz, phenomenologist I've already mentioned, talks about absorption, which is when the mind is saturated into the activity, or the activity is saturated in the mind. So there's no easy way of separating them. One doesn't feel oneself to be detached. One feels absorbed, so the mind is sort of dissolved into it. You also find it in William James. I think he's really interesting what he talks about it. He came up, of course, with the idea of the stream of consciousness, which is a fantastic phrase, stream of consciousness, and very revealing. And it's so familiar that we forget, I think, at least I certainly forget, that it's a metaphor. And when we're using that term, what's happening beneath the surface of our mind, beneath the surface of our conscious, rational mind certainly, is that we're mobilizing this image of a river running its course, unimpeded, but also bounded to a certain extent. So we have stream of consciousness. Also in William James, in one of his essays called Varieties of Religious Experience, he uses the term oceanic to describe what sort of mental state religious experience conjures up or produces a feeling of sort of unboundedness and of complete continuity between oneself and everything around oneself. That term oceanic was also picked up by Freud, I understand, and it's more recently been used by a really interesting writer, Catherine Clément, I think it's pronounced, it's French, who again talks about this sort of oceanic feeling, this sense of being dissolved into something larger. And perhaps slightly less reputably, the once sports reporter turned mystic David Icke made a comment in a little book he wrote called Tales from the Time Loop, where it says something like, we are all droplets of water in the ocean, or something like that. I'm not holding up as a credible reference, but I think it's interesting that again the same metaphor is being mobilized for a state of mind. There's also a really beautiful poem actually by Rabindranath Tagore, the Indian poet and writer, and he actually uses that metaphor quite a bit. But there's a beautiful poem he wrote called "Ocean of Forms," in which again he mobilizes the liquidity metaphor to describe a certain sort of way of being. He doesn't draw a distinction between mind and body in the poem, obviously, but he's using it as a poetic metaphor. But I think it's interesting that that idea of the mind and different states of mind being equated with this liquid substance, and the different states the liquid substance can be in, from a narrowly bounded river to a kind of ocean, to a kind of unbounded ocean, and being absorbed to being contained in other ways, is revealing, I think. The fact it does populate both poetry of Tagore certainly and others, but also, you know, psychological theory and you know, real science. And it may be that other substances could also apply. One of the things I've been thinking about looking back at these videos is quite a lot of these videos are hard to hear because of the wind that whips through them. Where I'm walking my dogs, it does get quite windy sometimes, and I know it can be hard to hear. So maybe there's an interesting parallel to be drawn with this, I hate to say it, but this kind of ethereal substance, the wind and the air around us. Maybe there's a way of mobilizing that additional metaphor. We don't really talk about the mind in that way. I can't think offhand of any gaseous or pneumatic metaphors for mind, but maybe there are some, and maybe we can conjure some up. Actually, having said that, when we talk about spirit, that's kind of a gaseous metaphor. Certainly to the extent that I imagine spirits at all, which I don't, but to the extent that I force myself to, I imagine it as a kind of ectoplasmic gas. So maybe there's a sense in which, even at that level, we're using a kind of liquid substance metaphor for mind or spirit or soul or some essential component of self, which at certain points sort of sublimates away from the body and becomes this vapor.